Out of the crucible of the Second World War, a revolutionary jet engine arose that would transform aviation. From coast to coast and around the globe, passengers would fly faster, higher, and more comfortably than ever before. Jet flight began with high hopes and sudden disaster, but it would change the world.
Chasing the Sun was made possible by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology. The foundation also seeks to portray the lives of the men and women engaged in scientific and technological pursuit. The Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
In the summer of 1925, a young man and his bride traveled by private rail car to Los Angeles. They brought with them parcels from Cartier and Tiffany, $50,000 in cash, and 2 automobiles. It was an arranged marriage, one forced on the young man by relatives after his overbearing mother and millionaire father passed away. It would prove to be a futile attempt to control it, for this 20-year-old was about to take the airline business by storm. Howard Hughes had arrived. Hughes had enough money to do whatever he pleased. When he decided to make movies, he simply became a producer. Then Hughes fell in love with flying. At the age of 27, the young mogul combined his 2 passions. Hughes assembled a private air force of World War I fighters from 4 different countries. His epic was the most realistic flying film of its time and cost a whopping $4 million. Hughes' love for flying was rooted in a secret. Due to a childhood illness, he was practically deaf and heard a continual ringing in his ears. Too proud to wear a hearing aid, Hughes was only truly happy in the cockpit of a plane. There, the ringing in his ears was masked by the roar of the engine, and he left the world behind. In 1933, he founded the Hughes Aircraft Company for the sole purpose of building fast planes for him to fly. His triumph was the H-1 Racer. Hughes liked to call it, "My beautiful little thing." In 1935, he flew the plane 351 miles per hour, the fastest speed ever. Then Hughes flew a Lockheed Electra around the world in a record 4 days. He arrived in New York to a hero's welcome. Howard Hughes was now a household name in aviation. In 1939, Hughes' fame and fortune caught the attention of Jack Fry, president of Trans World Airlines. At Fry's urging, Hughes bought up enough TWA stock to take over the company. Hughes' investment allowed the airline to buy the new Boeing Stratoliner. The first plane with a pressurized interior cabin, the Stratoliner could fly above most turbulence. A coast-to-coast trip took only 14 hours, with one refueling stop. But for the speed-obsessed Hughes, even one stop was too many.
Howard Hughes was a visionary. He knew that the airplanes in service were not sufficient in order to make commercial aviation the kind of viable, popular means of transportation he wanted it to be. He wanted a new airplane, and that new airplane was the Constellation. The Constellation was going to fly higher, it was going to fly faster, it was going to be more comfortable. For the first time, there was going to be a luxurious airliner capable of non-stop cross-country service.
Hughes personally financed the construction of the Constellation. To get a jump on the other airlines, he wanted it built in secret. The Lockheed Company of Burbank, California, agreed to his terms. But Hughes' behavior was becoming eccentric. He obsessed over security and required everyone to have a code name. Lockheed President Robert Gross would be called the Apostle Paul. TWA President Jack Fry was Jesus Christ. Hughes would be referred to as God. He sent a TWA engineer named John Guy to Burbank to oversee the project. Guy was ordered to rent a house far from any Lockheed employee. He found one on Cypress Street. The paranoid Hughes demanded that before sending Constellation reports back to TWA, Guy remove sensitive information from the papers in case they fell into the wrong hands.
I couldn't even tell my wife and family what I was really doing in Burbank. When letters, drawings, and other Lockheed data came to Cypress Street, I would take a razor blade and cut out all the names and company identification. Some of the documents would look like Swiss cheese.
Hughes' obsession with security infected everyone on the project. John Guy anxiously searched for places to confer where agents from rival airlines could not overhear the latest plans.
To avoid drawing attention, we would meet at places like Griffith Park with data for the Constellation. If someone approached, we would hastily move on.
But all of Hughes' attempts at secrecy would be in vain. In 1941, with war looming, the Army demanded that all airplane manufacturers share their latest designs. The instant Lockheed revealed the Constellation, Hughes' potential lead over his competitors evaporated. Secret or not, when the Connie finally made its debut, it was hailed as the most advanced plane in the world. Its unique fuselage was incredibly aerodynamic and large enough for 60 passengers. Howard Hughes and Jack Fry piloted the first Constellation across the country in a record-shattering 6 hours and 58 minutes. In the coming years, Hughes' bizarre behavior would result in his being ousted from TWA. But the Constellation would be his enduring legacy to aviation. World War II would have more impact on the airline industry than any other event in history. The huge demand for warplanes quickly transformed the nation's small aircraft manufacturers into mighty industries. They would produce a staggering 300,000 airplanes by the end of the war. The war would also have a tremendous impact on the airlines. Before 1941, America's only international carrier was one trip's Pan American Airways. When war broke out in the Pacific, the Japanese considered Pan American's bases on Wake Island, Guam, and Midway to be second in importance only to Pearl Harbor. After December 7th, the Japanese left each base in ruins. Pan American's prized clipper fleet escaped and was turned over to the armed forces. The domestic airlines also joined the war effort and prepared to fly around the world for the first time. For the pilots of these planes, international flying was a dangerous new experience. A fun-loving TWA pilot named William Vanderkloot had flown a small passenger plane on the Kansas City to Albuquerque run. When the war began, Vanderkloot, still a TWA employee, was assigned to fly a B-24 bomber on long-distance overseas missions. The experience landed him an unexpected assignment: flying British Prime Minister Winston Churchill on a risky mission to Cairo, where the Prime Minister had to meet with his beleaguered generals. Once Vanderkloot took off, there was no radio contact for fear of discovery by Nazi fighters.
Early in the flight, the Prime Minister came up to sit in the co-pilot seat. He turned to me and remarked, "You know what Hitler would do to me if he ever got his hands on me, don't you, Vanderkloot?" I allowed that I had a fairly clear idea. "But you're not gonna let him do it, are you, Captain?" Churchill asked with a twinkle in his eye. Here I am, an American civilian, with the very life of the Prime Minister of Great Britain in my sweaty hands.
Vanderkloot did not allow Hitler to get his hands on Churchill, and the Prime Minister asked him to become his personal pilot. The Germans knew about the young American and his famous passenger, but were never able to intercept them. By the end of the war, domestic airlines like TWA and pilots like Vanderkloot had circled the globe carrying troops and cargo. Now, with Pan American's monopoly coming to an end, they wanted a piece of the international pie. TWA was awarded passenger routes to 4 different continents. American Airlines gained flights to Europe. Northwest was granted rights to Asia. With a variety of airlines to choose from, many traveled abroad for the first time.
You see, as a travel agent, I know that from right here in Topeka, you can fly all the way to 17 countries overseas. This flight takes you non-stop to Paris, you know.
Oh, yes, Paris. Oh, I've always wanted to see Paris.
By the early 1950s, it appeared that airplanes might finally overtake ocean liners and trains as the most popular way to travel long distances. But propeller planes were reaching their limit in size and power. Fortunately, an entirely new kind of engine was waiting in the wings. The man who invented the jet engine was born to a working-class family in Coventry, England in 1907. Frank Whittle's earliest memory was of lying on the floor, watching his favorite toy, a wind-up Blériot airplane.
Its propeller was driven by clockwork, and it was much too heavy for a flying model. But it could be suspended from a bracket, and it would perform a circle until the spring ran down. It is linked in my mind with memories of occasional flights over Coventry by early aviators.
Frank's working-class background meant that his academic opportunities were limited. At 15, he joined the Royal Air Force to become a mechanic. But because of his impressive engineering skills, he was chosen instead to become an officer and packed off to flying school. There, Whittle learned about one of the great problems of early aviation. It had been discovered that aircraft encounter far less turbulence at higher altitudes. But the higher the plane flew, the worse the engine performed. In 1928, Whittle wrote a thesis proposing alternatives to piston-driven propeller engines. His instructor commented, "I couldn't quite follow everything you have written, but I can't find anything wrong with it." Whittle became one of the RAF's best pilots. But when he wasn't flying planes, he was trying to figure out how they could travel faster than ever before. The young officer soon hit on a novel idea: use high-pressure gases to create a jet-propelled engine. Whittle's idea was a burst of genius. He was convinced it could work, and his superiors were very impressed. They arranged a meeting in London with RAF experts who were skeptical of the young officer's theories.
I was instructed to report to the Air Ministry with my sketches and calculations. I explained my ideas to W.L. Tweedy and to Dr. A.A. Griffith.
Whittle's proposed engine drew compressed air into a combustion chamber, where it was mixed with fuel and ignited. As the resulting hot gas blasted out the back of the chamber, it pushed the engine forward. But the experts thought that Whittle was an impractical dreamer.
I left in rather low spirits. It was pointed out that certain of my assumptions were over-optimistic and that I'd made a mistake in my calculations. The Air Ministry said that materials did not exist capable of withstanding the high temperature and high stresses which a gas turbine would create.
He felt very disappointed, knocked right down. But he was a very persistent man, and he went on developing his ideas, even though nobody sponsored him.
Six years later, several of Whittle's RAF colleagues decided to invest in his idea. They set up a company in the town of Rugby called Power Jets Limited. In 1937, Power Jets built the WU, the Whittle unit. The unwieldy contraption couldn't possibly fit in a plane, but it would demonstrate whether jet propulsion was feasible. Whittle and his team were unable to afford safety equipment. When they tested the engine for the first time, they were knowingly risking their lives.
When the starter motor had raised the speed to about 1,000 RPM, I opened the control valve, which admitted fuel to the combustion chamber. For a second or two, the speed of the engine increased slowly. Then, with a rising shriek like an air raid siren, the speed began to rise rapidly. Fortunately, the acceleration ceased. This incident did not do my nervous system any good at all. I have rarely been so frightened.
Whittle's investors were frightened as well, and the funding for his work began to dry up. Deeply frustrated, he retreated to his office in a Gothic manor called Brownsover Hall.
Being situated in a very quiet area enabled him to discuss with his colleagues his various ideas and, then the draftsman to get on with it without having all the smell of kerosene and noise around, which was quite distracting.
Whittle spent countless hours trying to solve the design problems of the WU. During months of uncertainty, he suffered from debilitating headaches and became addicted to painkillers and tranquilizers. But just as the health of Whittle and his project were about to collapse, his fortune changed. As war threatened Europe, the Air Ministry decided to make a modest investment in power jets. By 1939, Whittle's team successfully redesigned and tested the WU and won a contract to develop a flight-worthy jet engine, an engine that would change aviation forever. On May 15, 1941, at an airbase in Coventry, Whittle's engine was ready to make its first test flight in an experimental plane called the Gloucester Pioneer.
When the jet took off, someone shouted, "Frank, it flies!" I replied that was what it was bloody well designed to do.
When the U.S. military heard about the amazing new engine, one was sent under heavy security to the General Electric Company near Boston. Based on Whittle's design, the U.S. began to build a jet of its own. The British were already moving forward with the production of the Meteor, a jet fighter that saw limited action in the war. Soon, the secret was out, and Whittle was identified as the inventor of the jet engine. A photo of 4-year-old Frank with his toy airplane was on the front page of British newspapers. Power jets grew, expecting to build many more engines. But Whittle and his team could not have been more wrong. With the jet finally proven, corporations like Rolls-Royce and de Havilland swept in to claim the lucrative prize.
Suddenly, the established aero engine industry decided that power jets should only do development work, test work, and not build complete engines, which was a very great disappointment to us, and ultimately led to the team voting with their feet, I'm sorry to say.
Stressed and exhausted, Whittle also decided to leave the company. he returned to Brownsover Hall and drafted his letter of resignation.
To me, what has happened is little short of a tragedy. The engineering team which launched the aircraft turbine has been bludgeoned into ineffectiveness. No team had a greater right to carry on doing the work for which it was most fitted, yet their reward is bitterness and resentment.
Soon after resigning, Whittle suffered a nervous breakdown and was hospitalized. In 1948, the RAF informed him that due to his ill health, Whittle had to retire from the service in which he had spent all of his adult life.
Frank was absolutely devastated. He must have been on the point of suicide. And he had all the technical problems to solve, all the financial problems, and he'd overcome all this. And then right at the end, it's like picking fruit. You've done all the work to grow the fruit, and then somebody comes along and takes it.
As consolation, the government presented Whittle with the Inventor Award and a prize of £100,000. He received a knighthood and became Sir Frank Whittle.
The satisfaction it gave me was overshadowed by my regret that I was leaving the service in which I had served since the age of 16, and which gave me the training that made possible the jet engine.
With Whittle and his team pushed aside, the stage was set for a new battle. A battle between American and British industry to see who would profit from the jet engine. On the day of the Nazi surrender, aeronautical engineers from Britain and the United States raced each other to a secret facility near Munich. There they discovered a technological treasure trove. The most valuable find was a revolutionary airplane, a jet-powered fighter called the Messerschmitt 262. German engineers designed a jet engine after Frank Whittle, but their jet was the first to fly. Due to strong Nazi support, one aircraft quickly evolved into the Messerschmitt 262, a lightning-fast jet fighter that saw combat in the war. A British engineer who first viewed the captured plane was dumbstruck.
The scale on which science and engineering have been harnessed to the chariot of destruction is indeed amazing. We will be lucky in not having to meet German as well as American competition in the evolution of civil transport.
A critical German innovation was swept-back wings, which performed much better at high speeds than straight wings. Within weeks of examining the design of the 262, both Boeing and de Havilland engineers were planning jet aircraft with swept-back wings. Just 4 years later, a silver airplane screamed over a crowd at England's Farnborough Air Show. It was the de Havilland Comet, the world's first jet-powered passenger plane. It flew 44 passengers at 480 miles an hour at an unheard of 40,000 feet. The British had beaten the US to jet travel. Group Captain John Cunningham was de Havilland's chief test pilot. In 1948, he was asked by a friend from Lockheed to demonstrate Britain's new jet.
I said I would be delighted and took him up on a test flight from Hatfield. And he was almost speechless with delight at the smoothness and simplicity. The Comet was the hope for Britain, the first step forward into the civil aviation business.
Soon airlines around the world were beating a path to de Havilland's door, and the company had orders for over 100 Comets. There was just one problem. In their first 2 years of service, 3 jets crashed. But most passengers wrote off the accidents as bad luck. Then, in 1954, a British Overseas Airways Comet took off from Rome, bound for London. The 29 passengers gladly paid premium prices to reach their destination in comfort, and in half the time it would take on a propeller plane. The captain had agreed to radio a nearby Canadian aircraft and describe the clouds as he passed above them. 19 minutes into the flight, the Canadians heard him say, "George, did you get my..." And the message abruptly ended. Far below, an Italian fishing trawler was cutting through the waves of the Mediterranean. One of the crew, Giovanni DeMarco, heard 3 explosions.
I saw a silver thing flash out of the clouds. Smoke came from it, and it hit the sea. By the time we got there, all was still again. There was some debris in the water, which we began to pick up. But there was nothing we could do.
Unlike the other crashes, this one happened in calm weather. Explanations were not readily at hand. The first large-scale investigation of an airplane crash began. One of the grounded comets was immersed in a giant tank of water to mimic pressurization in the atmosphere. Its wings were pushed hydraulically to simulate thousands of hours of flight. After almost 2,000 simulated flights, the fuselage burst. Metal fatigue was the comet's Achilles heel. Its thin skin could not withstand the stress of high-altitude flight.
We learnt the hard way, and de Havillands were determined that our failings would be known. The last thing in the world we wanted was that to happen again to anyone else. Sure enough, Lockheed, Douglas, and Boeing all said, well, but for your problems, it would probably have happened to one of us.
De Havilland redesigned the Comet as a safe, reliable aircraft. But they had lost their commanding lead, and the Americans were coming. In the early 1950s, U.S. airline executives were decidedly uninterested in building passenger jets. They argued that jet engines burned too much fuel to be economically viable. They were convinced that the real money was in flying a few wealthy passengers in propeller planes. One man disagreed. Juan Trippe, the head of Pan American Airways, had a new idea.
Air transport has the very clear choice of being a luxury service to carry the well-to-do at high prices, or to carry the average man at what he can afford to pay. Pan American has chosen the latter course.
Trippe was selling low-fare flights for Puerto Ricans migrating to New York. But in order to profit on an international scale, Trippe needed a much larger aircraft that could only be powered by jet engines, not propellers. A plane that the manufacturers were reluctant to build. And so, Trippe came up with a strategy to get his large jet plane. Like a poker player, he would lure the manufacturers into betting against each other. The Lockheed Company refused to play. Boeing stayed in the game. They anteed up by building a jet prototype, but adamantly refused Trippe's request to make it larger. Next, it was Donald Douglas' turn. Douglas couldn't resist Trippe's challenge. His engineers designed the company's first jet, but it too was not large enough to suit Trippe. Now, Juan Trippe played his hand, a classic bluff. Although they were not quite what he wanted, Trippe placed orders with both companies for their smaller jets.
Talk about hiding your cards. His card never showed. And so there was a meeting of one of the airline associations in New York, and all the big executives came, and Trippe invited them up to his house. And they were all milling around, sipping cocktails, and he moves from one group to another, and he says, "Oh, I've signed a contract for 40 jets. Yes, they'll be along soon." And he moves on to the next group. Put them all in a panic, had them all running out to telephones to order their own jets. That must have tickled him. He probably never cracked a smile while he was doing this. And that was the start of the jet age.
Trippe's gamble paid off. When he and the other airlines gave most of their orders to Douglas, Boeing finally agreed to build the larger jet plane Trippe had wanted all along, the 707.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. Welcome to the jet age. On our flight plan today, we'll be covering 4,800 miles in 8 hours, and we'll be in smooth air, cruising in sunshine all the way.
It's hard to imagine today what a radical change the introduction of the 707 brought. It was not turbulent. It was quiet. The food, it seemed, was excellent. Maybe the food wasn't better. It seemed better because it wasn't accompanied by all the shaking that it had been before.
The first Pan Am 707 flew in 1958, and Juan Trippe soon had a 90% occupancy on his jets. A few months later, American Airlines inaugurated the first non-stop 707 flight from Los Angeles to New York. At a blazing 600 miles an hour, the transcontinental flight took only 5.5 hours. One of the passengers, the poet Carl Sandburg, wrote that he had been whisked, streaked, zipped, flicked, sped, hurtled, flashed, and shuttled across the sky faster than Phaeton's chariot pulled the sun. The elegant 707 represented the future of air travel and helped guarantee that America would dominate the business of flying. By the mid-1950s, travelers were becoming more comfortable in airplanes. The airlines could now afford to focus on selling the experience of flying. And the stewardess changed from caring nurse to glamorous hostess. The airlines required women to be single, and in their training classes, they emphasized dress, manner, and appearance.
A uniform does things for a girl. And when they top it off with a cute stewardess cap, well, it's no wonder people like to fly.
And women liked to become stewardesses. In 1951, American Airlines received 20,000 applications for 350 openings. It was a striking comment on the times.
In the 50s, airlines often promoted their service by saying, "Today's stewardess is tomorrow's wife." And many women in this era didn't think there was any future except matrimony anyway, but what was important about airline service is it allowed them a wider range of choices, so these women could exercise more control over their future than their counterparts. They actually could select among the many passengers and pilots they would meet, so it wasn't just important for the years that they were a stewardess, but could affect their whole lives.
With the advent of jet flight, a certain type of passenger grew in number, one with an expense account. Businessmen were the airline's most profitable customers, and the airlines looked for new ways to woo them.
Airlines in the 60s are afraid that maybe air travel has become just one more part of the rat race, and they want to introduce some excitement.
I'm Rose, and I'm going to fly you like you've never been flown before. Fly me. Fly me.
Airlines began introducing stewardesses' sexuality as kind of a thrill.
Braniff Airlines led the way, with eye-popping colors, provocative clothing, and space helmets. The airline further pushed the boundaries of good taste with their so-called air strip. During the flight, a stewardess slowly removed her stylish outfit to reveal another one underneath.
The airstrip is brought to you by Braniff International, who believes that even an airline hostess should look like a girl.
One young stewardess, Paula Kane, experienced a growing awareness of how she was being exploited.
I can see now that the airlines have carefully constructed an airborne fantasy world. The image of the stewardess has taken its place next to the Playboy bunny in our national psyche. We are all supposed to be the fresh, wholesome girls who love men and the submissive partners to male sexual fantasies.
Oh, good afternoon. What's your name?
Elaine Vaughan.
I see.
Whether it was due to marketing strategies or the ease of jet flight, the airlines became wildly successful. Between 1955 and 1972, the number of passengers swelled from 42 to 205 million. Jet aircraft had truly begun to connect the peoples of the world, and there seemed to be no limits to where technology might take us. In the early 1960s, men and machines were blasting into space. Few questioned technology's potential to make the world a better place.
None of the kind of doubts that we have today about technology had really yet started to surface. It was still the moonshot era, you know. People thought the sort of things that went fast, that they were big machines that went very, very quick, were terrific.
Most of the advances were being made by the U.S., to the alarm of many Europeans. In response, the French proposed building the first SST, the supersonic transport. The British also wanted an SST. The demise of the Comet made their reasons more personal.
the failure of the Comet carried a lot of significance in Britain because they thought that they could dominate this industry. And with the Comet, they certainly had a chance to dominate the industry. But because it didn't ultimately work, because it wasn't ultimately safe, they lost that chance.
Hoping for redemption, the British joined forces with the French to build the first supersonic passenger jet. In 1962, an Anglo-French treaty was signed to build an SST called the Concorde. U.S. politicians were not going to allow America to fall behind, and the government spent millions on SST research. But how much would this new craft really cost? No one knew. And what about that annoying byproduct of supersonic flight, the sonic boom? The government did its best to explain the phenomenon to the public.
An aircraft in supersonic flight disturbs the air and creates pressure waves. These waves of disturbed air travel across the ground and reach our ears as sudden explosive sounds. An aircraft flying faster than sound could create a boom that would startle the tens of millions of people along the eastern seaboard in a mere 10 minutes.
In 1964, the government decided to test public reaction with a 6-month experiment called Operation Bongo. Supersonic F-104 jets flew over Oklahoma City at 8 preset times every day. At first, most took the booms in stride. After all, Oklahoma City was an Air Force town. But then the Air Force increased the intensity of the blasts. Scores of windows were broken. Public opinion was mixed.
How do you feel about the booms?
Well, in particular, I don't think we should have them.
I don't see any need for them, and I think that anything that they learn after the 30 days is surplus.
Do the booms bother you any at all?
No, sir, they don't.
You wouldn't mind then if they kept booming them from now on, huh?
I think they should.
The final FAA report concluded that a significant portion of the population would not accept sonic booms as a part of daily life. In spite of the public's reaction, Boeing unveiled its $2 million wooden SST mock-up and beat Lockheed for a lucrative government contract. But engineers soon discovered serious problems with its retractable wing design. The SST's political problems presented an even bigger challenge. Environmental groups were gaining national power for the first time, and they loudly opposed the potential air and noise pollution.
We don't want it, we don't need it, we're trying to shove it down our throats and we're not going to digest it, and that's it.
The protesters found a surprising ally, Charles Lindbergh.
He saw how aviation had changed the face of the earth, how civilization was encroaching upon wilderness areas. And so he spent the last 25 years of his life as a crusader for the conservation movement. And he felt, in a way, aviation had gone too far, that in a way we were going fast enough. And as a result of that, when the SST came up for a vote, he was opposed to the supersonic transport. It was a bit of a shock, certainly to people in the aviation industry. But in the end, Lindbergh said, if I had to choose between planes and birds, I would choose birds.
In 1971, Congress voted against funding of the SST, and the U.S. bowed out of the supersonic race. Now the British and French controlled the SST market, and the Concorde was unveiled with great fanfare. But the celebration wouldn't last long. Sales of the plane were doomed by high fuel prices and by banned overland flights. Only British Airways and Air France placed orders, and just 14 Concordes took to the skies. The plane's small cabin could only accommodate 128 passengers. At $4,000 a ticket, this plane of the future was just for the elite. The Concorde was a financial failure, but its design captured the world's imagination.
It's got that James Bond, slightly kitsch, 60s feel to it. You know, it looks like a bird. It's a beautiful plane. In 100 years' time, small boys will still build models of the Concorde.
But the Europeans had bet on the wrong bird. Supersonic travel for the rich was not where aviation was headed. For the first time in history, speed would not rule the skies. Sir Frank Whittle and the Concorde were bittersweet partners in the annals of jet flight. Whittle created the jet engine, but the industry passed him by. The Concorde was a marvel, but never made money. In 1983, as a British Airways Concorde landed at Washington Dulles Airport, the captain made an announcement.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have covered the 3,900 miles in 3 hours and 37 minutes at well over 1,000 miles per hour. Today, we have the honor of carrying Sir Frank Whittle, who invented the jet engine, which made all of this possible.
A round of applause greeted the white-haired passenger in question, who simply nodded in acknowledgement.
The Chasing the Sun adventure continues at PBS Online. Relive the romance of the golden age of flying. Trace the evolution of the world's greatest planes. Learn about the real lives of aviation's pioneers. The interactive journey begins at pbs.org.
Next on Chasing the Sun, high-tech computers open a three-dimensional world for air traffic controllers struggling to keep the skies safe.
It was like being inside a video game. We used a sixth sense, one the computers will never have. We had to learn to flow with the traffic, as if it were an art form or part of some piece of music.
Next time on Chasing the Sun.
Chasing the Sun was made possible by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology. The foundation also seeks to portray the lives of the men and women engaged in scientific and technological pursuit. The Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. To order a video cassette of this program or the complete 4-part boxed set collection of Chasing the Sun, call 1-800-343-4727 or write to the address on your screen.
This is PBS.